but she could not initiate. I've worked with kids who, one in particular stands out, a boy with Williams syndrome who, when completely overwhelmed with too much stimulation, too much sensory input, or with a task that exceeded his capacity to reason or understand, he would completely shut down, look down, withdraw, make no movement, no response, could not initiate making eye contact, could not initiate saying, "I need help, please say that again, please show me, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do." Would literally almost freeze, tense his muscles up and be stuck, frozen. So, and that's what I'm talking about with this inability to initiate. It's not that a person lacks the knowledge that they need to start doing something. It's that they don't have the capacity to self-start, or to do so within the time constraints of whatever the needs are of that situation. Beyond that, sometimes you'll see if you can use some external cues, some visual cues, some physical prompts to help someone get going, then you're faced with the problem of persistence. That is, how to persist with efforts till I'm done. And that's not a given. It's not an automatic skill. And the end part of this is to be able to terminate your efforts as appropriate. I've seen a lot of kids, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids here in our clinic who, once you get going, they sort of get caught up in this loop of just continuing on, continuing on, continuing on. And another executive function component, which is self-monitoring and self-awareness, doesn't kick in. And so at some point they will have achieved the task, whether it's to make your block design look like ours, or let's make a bubble boat, or simple science experiments, simple cooking projects, simple hands-on functional craft or science or experiment type activities. And at some point they have achieved that outcome, and they have no awareness that they're done, and they just keep going, keep going, keep going, to the point where sometimes they undo what they've done before. Initiation and persistence. Flexibility as a fourth component of executive functions. Flexibility is the idea that after you have determined your behavioral goal, and you've generated a plan and organized and sequenced those steps, and then you have initiated efforts toward that goal, you will have to change. Change happens all the time, whether you're 2, 6, 12, 35, 50, or 80. We have to be able to adapt, revise the plan, revise the goal, revise the strategy, rejuggle the sequence of events, modify our behaviors if there's a new element in the environment that we have to account for, shift our attention, refocus our attention on something else. Kids who have difficulty, by the way, with skills like divergent thinking, verbal fluency, multiple meanings for words, generating lists of items that belong in certain categories, being able to creatively think about different ways to use common objects, novel problem solving, coming up with as many different ways as you can to describe X, coming up with as many different ways as you can to solve Y, coming up with as many different meanings, examples, features of, characteristics of. This is part of that idea of flexibility. And so sometimes you'll see a child who can come up with one potential idea, but not multiple. And the one that they came up with isn't effective for the situation. So we may think it's a given that if you're in the social situation and you want to engage with some other kids in a socially appropriate manner, if you only have one way of doing so, can you come up with multiple other ways if the first attempt fails? And inflexibility is a huge hallmark of some deficits in executive function. Adults who have acquired frontal lobe deficits and children who have developing differences in executive function, they both show inflexible behavior, perseverative behavior that does not change, that does not flex, and does not meet the ever-changing needs of a circumstance, of a communication interaction, of a problem, of a homework assignment, what have you. So flexibility is another key component to these executive functions. Okay, execution and goal attainment. So now that I have got some fundamental of those three underlying cognitive processes, I'm attentive, I can inhibit destructive or inaccurate or incorrect impulses, I can hold a lot of variables in working memory, I can select an appropriate goal for this circumstance, I can plan it, sequence it, organize it, I can initiate, I can be flexible and adapt when I need to. All of that culminates in the ability to execute, achieve the goal. So just because I can decide that it's probably more appropriate to just because I can tell you it's more appropriate to raise my hand and use a certain syntactical structure to ask a question or request clarification or to get more information. Just because I can say that and plan it and rehearse it doesn't necessarily mean that I can initiate using that. And it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that I can carry that out and execute it. Sometimes things fall apart here. You know, I've got all these other components of executive functions in place, but I can't carry it out. I can't persist. I can't be adaptable and generate a new plan. I don't have good attention. I don't have good self-evaluation, so I'm not really aware of whether or not I'm meeting the original goal. If I'm failing, if I'm succeeding, I don't really know. And one more. Self-regulation. This is like the biggest one. You know, this is the thing, this is the piece of executive functions that takes probably the longest to mature and develop. What am I doing right now? How well am I doing this? Am I carrying out the task as I intended it to be, or as others have required me to carry out this task? Am I meeting those external requirements? Do I need to react? Do I need to flex, shift, readapt, replan, resequence? Do I need to stop? Do I need to refocus and shift my attention to something else? In order to do these skills, you've got to have the language underlying that to support drawing conclusions. You've got to have the language that will help you form and express opinions, even if you don't verbalize them out loud. They're internally self-taught, self-mediated. And I think the most critical one is, can I make comparisons between A and B? How many different how many kids can you think of on your case who do not make good comparisons between simple, concrete items? If you can't do very simple categorical comparison and feature analysis, how can you do very abstract feature analysis of complex social, moral, ethical dilemmas? Because ultimately, really, all this adds up to is how the fully mature frontal lobe manages complex social, moral, ethical dilemmas. How do we solve the big problems? There's even some really interesting research that talks about the lifespan as a whole, and that wisdom, things like wisdom and selflessness and altruism, those are really the highest culminations of these executive functions. And that makes sense. I mean, think about the difference between the the 2-year-old whose frontal lobes are still forming and still very much in the beginning phases. And think about a person who's really kind of progressed through all of these 6 components to a point where they're forming opinions and drawing conclusions and making comparisons between huge social issues that have impact on lots of people and are really elements for social change or for the greater good of all people. I mean, those are kind of heady ideas, but that's where the end of this whole continuum goes. And, you know, I think it's really fascinating to take the language of a 4th grader. You know, the classroom in 4th grade is very different from that of 1st grade. You're going to have to do a lot more independent thinking, independent self-regulation, independent planning, comparison, judgment. Things are not spelled out for you in black and white in 4th grade the way they were in 1st grade. And make a leap ahead to 8th grade into freshman year in high school. There's a lot more independent decision making that's expected of you, and that takes place, and that's appropriate because you know, by 15, a lot of these neural structures, the myelinization, the synapse forming, the glucose usage, the neural networks that have linked up and myelinated and connected to all the other parts of the brain, the visual that we had about the dense interconnections. By about 15, those things are relatively mature. And so what you do with that, how your environment and your experience and the language capacity helps one 15-year-old self-regulate might be very different from how another 15-year-old self-regulates. And so I'm sure you can think of, you know, in your own life, you may have experience with 2 15-year-olds. One can act like she's 20 and the other might still act like they're 12. And that's just kind of that normal variance between kind of almost being there, you're physically at a level of maturity where you're ready to put into practice these executive function components in a more adult version of the world. You're ready to start testing the waters with some of your own self-regulation and planning and applying these 6 EF skills to bigger and more complicated problems.